The North Sea doesn't forgive mistakes. Portsmouth Harbor, March 1943. Cold rain hammered the deck of HMS Pembroke, a minesweeper that had seen too many close calls and lost too many sister ships. The water below was black, churning with currents that carried something far deadlier than salt and kelp: magnetic mines. German ones. Invisible killers that had turned the English Channel into a graveyard for Allied vessels. Petty Officer Daniel Marsh stood on the aft deck, grease staining his knuckles, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He wasn't supposed to be topside. His job was below, in the engine room, keeping the degaussing coils functional, making sure the ship's magnetic signature stayed low enough to slip past the mines. But tonight, he couldn't sleep. Not after what happened to HMS Britomart 3 days ago. She'd gone down in under 90 seconds. Marsh had watched from the dock as rescue boats pulled 8 men from the water. 8 out of 83. The mine had detonated directly beneath her keel, splitting the hull like paper. No warning. No chance. Just a flash, a sound like thunder cracking the earth, and then nothing but smoke and screaming. The Admiralty called it acceptable losses. Marsh called it murder. He turned his collar against the wind and stared out at the dark water. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, were dozens, maybe hundreds, of German mines moored to the seabed, drifting with the tide, waiting. The magnetic detonators were brilliant, in a horrible way. They didn't need contact. They just needed a ship's steel hull to pass close enough, and the electromagnetic field would trigger the fuse. Boom. Game over. The Royal Navy had developed countermeasures, degaussing, sweeping operations, detonation teams, but the Germans kept adapting. New fusing mechanisms. New sensitivity thresholds. New patterns. Every week, it seemed, the rules changed. And every week, more ships went down. Behind Marsh, a hatch clanged open. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Howell emerged, his face carved from stone and exhaustion. He was a man who'd stopped sleeping years ago, who moved through the ship like a ghost, checking valves, tightening bolts, muttering equations under his breath. "Marsh," Howell said, his voice flat. "Engine room. Now." "Yes, sir." But Marsh didn't move immediately. His eyes were still locked on the water, on the faint glow of phosphorescence where the waves broke against the hull. Something was wrong. He could feel it. A weight in his chest, a tightness in his throat. The kind of intuition you develop when you've spent too many hours in a steel coffin surrounded by explosives. "Marsh," Howell repeated, sharper this time. "Sir," Marsh said slowly, "do we have updated charts on the mine patterns?" Howell's jaw tightened. "We have what intelligence gives us, which is never enough." "They're laying them in grids," Marsh said. "I've been tracking the incidents. Every sunken ship in the past month, coordinates, depth, time of day. There's a pattern. They're not random." Howell stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You've been doing what?" Marsh reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, smudged with pencil marks and salt spray. It was a hand-drawn map of the channel, dotted with X's and circles, lines connecting them in overlapping grids. "I cross-referenced the casualty reports with tide schedules and magnetic declination data," Marsh explained. "The Germans aren't just dropping mines randomly. They're aligning them with compass bearings. Magnetic north. They're using the Earth's field to position them." Howell stared at the paper. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Where did you get this data?" "Casualty reports. Admiralty bulletins. And—" Marsh hesitated. "My father's compass. Your father's compass. It's a surveyor's model. Pre-war. Precision bearings. Not Navy issue." Howell's expression darkened. "You're using unauthorized equipment to conduct your own intelligence analysis." "Yes, sir." "That's a court-martial offense." "Yes, sir." The two men stood in the rain, the wind howling around them, the harbor lights flickering in the distance. Below deck, someone was shouting orders. A diesel engine coughed to life. The war moved forward, indifferent to their conversation. Finally, Howell folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat. "Get below, and bring that compass with you." "Sir, we're running a sweep at 0400. If your theory is correct, I want to know before we hit a mine ourselves." Marsh felt his pulse quicken. "You believe me?" Howell turned toward the hatch, his back to Marsh. "I believe the Germans are smarter than we give them credit for. And I believe desperation makes men creative." He paused. "Whether that creativity gets US killed or keeps us alive, we'll find out tomorrow." He disappeared below deck, leaving Marsh alone in the rain. Marsh looked down at his hands, stained with oil, scarred from sharp metal and hot engines. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't intelligence. He was just a mechanic from Dover who joined the Navy because his father had, and his grandfather before him. Men who understood machines, who could see the invisible threads connecting cause and effect. But now, standing on the deck of a ship that could explode at any moment, he wondered if seeing those threads would be enough. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of diesel and salt. Somewhere in the darkness, the mines waited. 0400 hours. The sea was a sheet of black glass. HMS Pembroke cut through the water at 8 knots, her degaussing coils humming beneath the deck, her crew silent and tense. No lights. No radio chatter. Just the low rumble of engines and the rhythmic slap of waves against steel. Marsh stood in the engine room, his father's compass balanced on a makeshift mount he'd rigged from scrap aluminum and rubber tubing. The needle quivered, catching the ship's magnetic field, the Earth's pull, the invisible currents that flowed through metal and water and air. Lieutenant Howell stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes locked on the compass. He'd said nothing since they'd left port. Just watched. Calculated. Waited. "Bearing 274 degrees, Marsh called out, marking the reading on his chart. "Deviation consistent with previous plots." Howell grunted. "Meaning?" "Meaning, if I'm right, there's a mine approximately 200 yards northwest, positioned to catch ships entering the channel on a heading between 270 and 280 degrees. And if you're wrong, we sail right over it." Howell's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. Comforting. Above them, on the bridge, Captain Renwick was running the sweep by the book. Standard zigzag pattern, sonar pings, visual lookouts. But the book hadn't stopped HMS Britomart from sinking. Or HMS Leda. Or the dozen other ships that had vanished in the past 6 weeks. Marsh adjusted the compass mount, checking the alignment. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering. He'd spent 3 nights reconstructing the German mine patterns from casualty reports, cross-referencing magnetic variation charts, calculating probable drift based on tide schedules. It was guesswork. Educated guesswork, but still guesswork. And guesswork got people killed. "Bearing shifting," Marsh said. 278 degrees. Deviation increasing. Howell leaned in. "That's not drift. That's magnetic anomaly," Marsh finished. "Something down there with a strong field. Either a wreck or a mine." The word hung in the air like smoke. Howell grabbed the intercom handset. "Bridge, engine room. Recommend course change. Immediate." Static crackled. Then Captain Renwick's voice, clipped and skeptical. "On what grounds, Lieutenant?" "Magnetic anomaly detected. Bearing 278, range estimated 200 yards." A pause. "Sonar shows nothing." "Sonar won't pick up a moored mine unless we're practically on top of it," Howell shot back. "By then it's too late. We're following standard sweep protocols, Lieutenant. We don't deviate based on Based on what, sir? Based on the fact that we've lost 6 ships in this sector using standard protocols. Another pause. Longer this time. Marsh held his breath. The compass needle swung lazily, pointing toward something invisible, something deadly. Finally, Renwick's voice returned. Helm, come right 10 degrees. Reduce speed to 5 knots. The deck tilted slightly as Pembroke turned. The engines throttled back. Through the bulkhead, Marsh could hear the crew moving, tense and silent, everyone waiting for the explosion that might never come, or might come any second. The compass needle steadied. 282 degrees. Still showing deviation, but less pronounced. We're parallel to it now, Marsh said quietly. Whatever it is, we just missed it. Howell exhaled slowly. Or your compass is reading interference from our own degaussing system. It's not. You're that sure? Marsh met his eyes. I calibrated it against 3 different reference points before we left port. Checked it against the Admiralty's magnetic charts. Compensated for ship's deviation. This reading is real. Howell stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the intercom again. Bridge, recommend deploying marker buoy at current position. Possible mine contact. Acknowledged. Minutes later, they heard the splash as a buoy hit the water, a bright orange float with a flag, marking the spot for the demolition teams that would come later. If Marsh was right, they'd find a mine. If he was wrong, they'd find nothing, and he'd be reassigned to scrubbing bilges for the rest of the war. But Marsh wasn't worried about that. He was worried about the pattern. Because if his calculations were correct, the Germans weren't just laying mines randomly. They were using magnetic declination, the difference between true north and magnetic north, to create overlapping fields of coverage. It was brilliant. Diabolical. A 3-dimensional chess game played with invisible pieces. And the Royal Navy had been sailing blind. Take us through the next grid, Howell ordered, his voice low. Same method. For the next 3 hours, Pembroke crawled through the channel, Marsh calling out bearings, Howell relaying course corrections, the ship dodging invisible threats based on nothing but a mechanic's homemade compass and a theory that shouldn't work. But it did. By 0700, they'd marked 5 more anomalies. 5 potential mines. 5 spots where ships would have sailed, blind and confident, straight into oblivion. When they finally turned back toward Portsmouth, the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the water gold and red. Marsh stood on deck again, exhausted, hands shaking from adrenaline and lack of sleep. Howell found him there. The captain wants to see you. Am I being court-martialed? Probably. But first, he wants to know if you can teach someone else to do what you just did. Marsh blinked. Teach them. Intelligence is sending someone. A specialist. They want to know if your method is replicable. It is. The math is solid. You just need accurate bearings and a compass that isn't affected by. I don't need the lecture, Marsh. I need you to convince them. Howell's expression softened slightly. Because if you're right, if the Germans really are using magnetic patterns, then we've been fighting this war with one hand tied behind our backs. Marsh looked out at the water, at the markers they'd dropped, at the invisible minefield they'd just navigated. And if I'm wrong? Then we just wasted a morning and some fuel. But if you're right... Howell paused. Then you might have just saved a few hundred lives. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of salt and diesel and something else, something electric, metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marsh thought about HMS Britomart, about the men who drowned because no one understood the pattern, about the mines still waiting in the darkness. I'm not wrong, he said quietly. Howell nodded. Then let's make sure the brass believes you. They descended below deck, leaving the sunrise behind, heading toward a meeting that would either validate Marsh's theory or end his career. But somewhere, deep beneath the cold North Sea, the mines waited in their perfect, invisible grids. And now, for the first time, someone knew the pattern. The Admiralty building in Portsmouth smelled like old paper and bad coffee. Marsh had never been inside before. Never been summoned to a briefing with officers who wore more medals than he'd seen in his entire life. Never stood in front of a map table surrounded by men who could sink ships with a signature. He felt like a fraud. The room was windowless, lit by overhead lamps that cast harsh shadows across the tactical charts spread on the table. Red pins marked sunken vessels. Blue pins marked active minesweepers. Yellow pins marked suspected minefields. There were too many red pins. Commander Blackwood stood at the head of the table, a tall man with silver hair and eyes like chipped ice. He'd lost a destroyer to mines off Normandy in '42. Lost most of his crew. The rumor was he'd spent 6 hours in the water, clinging to wreckage, watching men drown. He didn't like theories. He liked results. "Petty Officer Marsh," Blackwood said, his voice clipped and precise. "Lieutenant Howell tells me you've developed a method for predicting German mine placement using an unauthorized surveyor's compass and basic trigonometry." "Yes, sir." "And you tested this method during this morning's sweep." "Yes, sir." "Resulting in the identification of 5 potential mine contacts." "Yes, sir." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Potential contacts. Not confirmed. The demolition teams haven't reached them yet, sir. But the magnetic readings are consistent with—" "Consistent with magnetic anomalies," Blackwood interrupted. "Which could be anything. Wrecks. Debris. Interference from your own ship's degaussing system." Marsh felt his jaw tighten. "I calibrated for all of those factors, sir." "Did you?" "It wasn't a question." Blackwood gestured to the map. "Explain your theory. Assume I'm skeptical." Marsh stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back to keep them from shaking. He pointed to the cluster of red pins in the channel. "The Germans aren't laying mines randomly. They're using magnetic declination, the difference between true north and magnetic north, to create overlapping coverage zones." "We know they're using magnetic detonators," another officer said, Lieutenant Commander Pierce, a demolition specialist with burn scars on his hands. "That's not new information." "But they're not just using them for detonation," Marsh pressed. "They're using them for positioning. Magnetic north shifts depending on location. In the channel, it's about 4 degrees west of true north. The Germans are exploiting that. They're laying mines along magnetic bearings, creating grids that follow the Earth's magnetic field lines." Blackwood crossed his arms. "To what end?" "To maximize coverage with minimum resources. A random minefield has gaps. Ships can slip through if they're lucky or smart. But a grid aligned with magnetic north, it's like a net. No matter which way you turn, you're moving parallel to the pattern. The only way to avoid it is to know the bearings." "And you determined these bearings how?" Marsh pulled out his folded chart, now creased and stained, and spread it on the table. "I cross-referenced every casualty report from the past 6 weeks with tide data, ship headings, and magnetic variation charts. Then I plotted the likely detonation points. They're not random. They follow lines of constant magnetic bearing." The room went silent. Pierce leaned over the chart, tracing the lines with a scarred finger. "Christ. He's right. Look at the spacing. Look at the angles." "It's a hypothesis," Blackwood said coldly. "Not proof." "Then let me prove it," Marsh said. The words came out harder than he intended, but he didn't back down. "Send me out again. Let me run another sweep. If I'm wrong, you lose a morning. If I'm right—" "If you're right," Blackwood finished, "then every ship we've lost in the past 2 months died because we didn't see the pattern." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. Howell spoke up, his voice steady. "The boy's method works, sir. I watched him navigate 5 anomalies this morning with nothing but a compass and a notepad. The readings were clean, consistent, repeatable." "And if the Germans change their pattern?" Blackwood challenged. "They won't," Marsh said. "Not unless they remap the entire channel's magnetic field. This isn't just a tactic, it's physics. The pattern is built into the geography." Blackwood stared at him. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the building, a telephone rang. Outside, the harbor bells clanged in the wind. Finally, Blackwood turned to Pierce. "Take him out. HMS Salamander. Run a full sweep of Sector 7. If he marks 10 anomalies and we confirm 5, I'll authorize broader implementation." "And if we hit a mine?" Pierce asked. "Then we'll have confirmation the old-fashioned way." Marsh felt his stomach drop. But he nodded. "Yes, sir." "One more thing," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "If you're right, petty officer, if you've cracked this, you'll have saved more lives than most admirals. But if you're wrong, you'll have sent good men to their deaths chasing a pattern that doesn't exist." "I understand, sir. Do you?" Blackwood stepped closer. "Because I've seen men die from bad intelligence, from faulty equipment, from theories that sounded brilliant on paper and got turned to scrap in the real world. I've pulled their bodies from burning oil. I've written letters to their families. So before you step on that ship, before you stake lives on a compass and a hunch, I need you to look me in the eye and tell me you're certain." Marsh met his gaze. His mouth was dry. His hands were cold. But his voice didn't waver. "I'm certain, sir." Blackwood held the stare for another heartbeat. Then he nodded. "Dismissed. Report to Salamander at 1400. The sweep began at dusk. HMS Salamander was smaller than Pembroke, faster, with a crew that had seen too much action and developed the kind of gallows humor that keeps men sane in insane circumstances. Pierce commanded from the bridge, calm and methodical, while Marsh worked in the cramped navigation room, his compass mounted on a shock-absorbing rig they'd welded together in 2 hours. The first anomaly appeared at 1452, bearing 271 degrees. Strong deviation. Clean reading. "Mark it," Pierce ordered. The second appeared at 1507, then the third, then the fourth. By 1600, they'd marked 8 anomalies. The pattern was undeniable, a perfect grid, aligned with magnetic north, spacing consistent with standard German mine deployment protocols. "Jesus," Pierce muttered, staring at the plot. "It's like they painted a picture and we've been staring at it upside down." Marsh didn't respond. He was already calculating the next bearing, his hands moving automatically, his mind locked into the rhythm of numbers and angles and invisible fields. The 9th anomaly appeared at 1623, the 10th at 1641. When they returned to port, the demolition teams were already mobilizing. By midnight, they'd confirmed 4 mines. By dawn, all 10. Every single reading had been accurate. In the Admiralty War Room, Commander Blackwood stood over the updated charts, red pins replaced by yellow, diffused, neutralized, no longer a threat. "Get this method distributed to every minesweeper in the fleet," he said quietly. "And get me Petty Officer Marsh." But Marsh wasn't thinking about commendations or promotions. He was thinking about HMS Britomart, about the men who drowned because the pattern had been invisible. Until it wasn't. 3 months later, the channel was clearer. Not safe. Nowhere was safe in 1943, but clearer. The Royal Navy had adapted Marsh's method, distributing modified compasses and training manuals to every minesweeper in the fleet. Intelligence had reverse-engineered the German mine deployment strategy, mapping the magnetic grids with precision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Ship losses dropped by 40%. 40%. That translated to lives. Hundreds of them. Men who sailed through the channel and lived to see port because someone had finally understood the pattern. But Marsh didn't feel like a hero. He stood on the deck of HMS Pembroke again, watching the sun set over Portsmouth Harbor, and all he could think about were the men who died before the pattern was known. The sailors on Britomart. The crews of Leda, Southwold, Partridge. The names kept piling up in his mind, a memorial built from casualty reports and sleepless nights. Lieutenant Howell found him there, 2 cups of coffee in hand, both lukewarm. "Thought you might need this." "Thanks." They stood in silence for a while, watching the harbor lights flicker on one by one. Pembroke was in port for repairs. Her degaussing coils needed replacement, and her hull had taken minor damage from a near miss 2 weeks ago. Near miss. That's what they called it when you didn't die. "Commander Blackwood put you up for a commendation," Howell said finally. "Distinguished Service Medal. Should be official next month." Marsh took a sip of coffee. It tasted like burnt rubber. "I don't want a medal. No one who deserves one ever does. I just figured out a pattern, Lieutenant. That's all. The Germans built it, I just saw it." "You saved lives, Marsh. That's more than most men do in this war." "I could have saved more." The words came out harsher than Marsh intended. "If I'd figured it out sooner. If I'd pushed harder. If—" "Stop." Howell's voice cut through the guilt like a knife. "You're a mechanic, not a prophet. You can't see the future. You can only work with what you know. But Britomart is not your fault." Howell turned to face him, his expression hard. "Listen to me. I've been in this Navy for 16 years. I've seen men die from bad luck, bad intelligence, bad orders, and bad timing. And every single time, the survivors torture themselves with, what if? What if we'd turned left instead of right? What if we'd checked the charts one more time? What if we'd been faster, smarter, luckier?" He paused, staring out at the dark water. "But war doesn't work on what-ifs, Marsh. It works on what is. And what is right now is that you saw something no one else saw. You trusted your gut, you did the math, and you gave us a fighting chance. That's all any man can do." Marsh wanted to argue, wanted to push back against the logic, the rationalization. But he couldn't, because Howell was right. The pattern had always been there. Invisible, deadly, perfectly designed. All Marsh had done was make it visible. "What happens now?" Marsh asked quietly. "Now?" Howell smiled grimly. "Now the Germans figure out we've cracked their system, and they change it. And we start all over again. That's the war. That's the war." They finished their coffee in silence. Above them, stars were beginning to appear through the clouds, cold, distant, indifferent. The universe didn't care about magnetic fields or mine patterns or men drowning in cold water. It just kept spinning. But down here, on the deck of a scarred minesweeper in a harbor full of ships that had survived against the odds, it mattered. Every calculation, every bearing, every life saved. By June 1944, the invasion of Normandy was underway. Marsh was there, aboard HMS Britomart too, a new ship, named for the one that had sunk, crewed by men who knew the cost. They swept the approaches to Utah Beach, clearing mines by the dozens, using compasses and math and hard-won knowledge to punch holes through the German defenses. On D-Day morning, as landing craft surged toward the shore and explosions lit up the sky, Marsh stood in the engine room with his father's compass, calling out bearings, marking safe channels, doing the only thing he knew how to do. Making the invisible visible. Years later, after the war ended, after the medals were awarded and the ships were mothballed and the men went home to try to remember what peace felt like, someone asked Marsh what it was like to have saved so many lives. He thought about that question for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't save anyone. I just found the pattern." The men who sailed the ships, who followed the bearings, who trusted the math even when it didn't make sense, they're the ones who saved themselves. But that wasn't quite true. Because patterns don't reveal themselves. They wait in the darkness, invisible and patient, until someone looks at the world the right way. Until someone sees the connections that shouldn't exist but do. Until someone trusts their gut and their compass and the cold mathematics of physics over the comforting fiction that chaos is unbeatable. The Germans had built a maze. Marsh had found the thread. And hundreds of men sailed home because of it. In the summer of 1945, with the war in Europe finally over, Marsh returned to Dover. He stood on the white cliffs, looking out at the channel that had tried to kill him for 2 years, and thought about all the ships that had crossed it. Some that made it, some that didn't. The mines were gone now. Cleared. Defused. Catalogued in reports that would gather dust in archives for decades. But the pattern remained. Written in magnetic declination and casualty reports and the memory of men who'd learned to see the invisible. Marsh reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's compass. The brass was worn, the glass scratched, the needle still perfect and true. He held it up to the light, watching it point north. Magnetic north, not true north, never quite aligned with the stars but always honest about its deviation. "Thank you," he said quietly, to his father, to the compass, to the mathematics that had kept him alive. Then he put it back in his pocket and walked away from the cliffs, toward home, toward a future built on the small certainty that sometimes, if you look hard enough, you can find the pattern in the chaos. And sometimes that's enough.